We are live. Robin.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. And for those of you here at CCS, thank you for attending this video discussion session. I'm really happy to be interested in the first discussion that's put together by the research platform offshore.co, which is co-founded by Kathleen Ditzade and myself, Robin Lynch. I'll just give a brief intro to today's event, titled Offshoring and Virtual Infrastructures, and a quick overview of the schedule, and then we'll get started with our first speaker. Designed to function in tandem and as a precursor to tomorrow's session on incorporating offshore and financial structures within art, today's event will be looking specifically at the development of the infrastructures that support global trade and offshore strategies, with a particular focus on communications technologies and logistics and the virtual. The development of offshore finance is simultaneous development of the World Wide Web. This development can be traced from the early implementation of telegraph lines along trade routes and military routes to the development of telecommunication cables, fiber optic cables, and submarine networks. These sites and the development of these infrastructures continue to be highly intertwined with territory, military, and economic interests, particularly as they become tactical nodes for mobility, efficiency, and the maximization of geographical boundaries. Specifically within offshore strategies, the development of offshore data havens for the storage, maintenance, and facilitation of communications technologies across national jurisdictions has been enabled by the market and economic structures that make these particular countries and nodes more conducive for the establishment of offshore sites and corporate subsidiaries. The participants today will take up various threads of this development, speaking to both a historical lens and a more contemporary examination. The speakers today are Yuri Pattison, Meredith Lackey, and Bill Maurer. Deborah Cohen sends her regrets. Unfortunately, she can't make it today, but we're hoping to collaborate with her in the future. And at the end of this, we'll have two respondents, Suhail Malik and Victoria Ivanova. I'm just going to give a brief bio for everyone who's speaking right now, just so that we can smoothly transition between the speakers. So Yuri Pattison is an Irish multimedia artist based in London, who studies the way in which the virtual world permeates material reality. Pattison is the current recipient of the Chisholm Hill Gallery Create Residency from 2014 to 2016. Recent solo exhibitions include Free Traveller at Cell Projects in London, Co-Location Time Displacement at Minibar in Stockholm, Sweden, and E-Ink Pearl Memory at Arcadia Missa in London. Meredith Lackey is an experimental filmmaker and artist whose research documents the political and economic relationships between business, states, and global infrastructure through the laying of fiber optic cables. She is the recipient of an award from the Princess Grace Foundation for her films, as well as the University of Chicago's Chancellor's Award for her film Shruvanta. Bill Maurer is the Dean of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Law at the University of California, Irvine. Maurer is a cultural anthropologist who conducts research on law, property, money, and finance, focusing specifically on the technological infrastructures and social relations of exchange and payment. Maurer has been recently involved more directly in curatorial work, particularly with his recent project at the British Museum on the past, present, and future of money. So each speaker is going to be speaking for 15 minutes consecutively, which will then be wrapped up by our two respondents, Suhail Malik and Victoria Ivanova, after which we will open up the discussion to the audience and the web for about 30 minutes, during which we'll take questions from our website, offshoreart.co, and from the group here. We won't be taking any questions from the Google Hangout itself. All questions should go through the website or the Facebook event page. So thanks again for tuning in, and with that, I will pass the floor to Yuri Pattison.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a couple of years. The images in the video are sourced via an outsourcing network, a microtask outsourcing network.
Yuri, sorry, we didn't hear. We lost you there for a second. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
Sure. Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So this is a work I've been making over the last couple of years. Economies. It is made using the Amazon Mechanical Turks network. For those uninitiated with that, the Amazon Mechanical Turks is an outsourcing network, microtask outsourcing network that allows you to be completed by anonymous workers. The network that Amazon created initially for server app and then rolled out the API to the public. The network is quite large and it covers a sort of an ever-shifting group of people, ever-shifting demographic of people worldwide. The workers are, and you are, as a requester, you are governed by restrict you from asking anything personal of the workers. So this project, I engaged with that network and wanted to build a portrait of that network through landscape views. So I asked the workers to post pictures of the views from the nearest window where they normally work. So in relation to today's discussion, I thought I'd present it because the idea of offshoring, we often think of in straightforward geographical terms. Turks allows a sort of separation, or sorry, that offshoring can occur through this interface, through this filter. So you may be like posting tasks that are completed in Bangladesh and India, but equally your neighbor may be completing these tasks. And I thought this interface, this sort of new level of outsourcing and this new level of offshoring in many ways was quite interesting, especially when related to the economy flows behind these jobs. So you also have the flow of money within Amazon's own networks, which is often bounced around through their various offshore businesses to avoid tax. So I guess we can watch it for a bit and catch up on the conversation later on.
All right, thanks, Jay. We'll play it for a bit with the sound.
So hopefully Yuri will be able to catch up with us later for the discussion, but right now I guess we'll move on to Meredith Lackey. So on to you, Meredith.
Okay, let me share my camera. All right, and now I'm going to screen share. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just activating my screen share. I'm going to share my entire desktop, so we're really getting to know each other today. All right, so can everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have been working on a project for about the last year that relates specifically to a network of fiber optic cables that extends from Portugal to Angola to South Africa to Brazil. So through my research of this fiber optic cable and other fiber optic cable systems, it becomes super apparent that these contemporary pathways for data rely on historically colonial and neo-colonial relationships. So I just want to talk a little bit about what it's been like to access some of these points of critical infrastructure. To give you a little context, I'm an experimental filmmaker and I shoot with 16mm, which is conscious on my part. I view the camera as an aesthetic tool through which I navigate the world and the subjects that I'm shooting, and I often find when I'm shooting with a film camera rather than a DSLR, it sounds simple, but simply having that marker differentiates my position with people and places that I'm working with from that of a journalist, or in some situations, like some conflict situations, from a war reporter. So I find traveling with a Bolex useful, although a little bit cumbersome at times. So in addition to the film I'm currently working on, I finished a film that I shot in Burma about 1.5 years ago, and I also took a trip to India because I wanted to do some research at the Mumbai Stock Exchange. So something that I think a lot about in my work specifically after that experience is how is it possible to simultaneously critique these global structures of capitalism, but to also be very aware of the fact that capitalism is a culturally specific phenomenon. So for example, when I was in Mumbai at the Bombay Stock Exchange, which I was able to get into through a roundabout series of events, there were a lot of high school students learning how to trade who were really excited to talk to me and to share their experiences about India's transition to global capitalism. And in addition, there was a wall of very well-known Western figures, specifically from the Chicago School of Economics and also Warren Buffett. So, you know, it was a wall that these young students kind of venerate. So, I think a lot about how to simultaneously critique these structures while being open to the relationship that the people I'm working with have. All right, so these are some images from the WAX fiber optic cable landing station. So this fiber optic cable landing station is located in Melkbosstrand, South Africa, just outside of Cape Town. And you can see this little thread in here is one point which the data or the fiber optic cable gets kind of broken up into. And here we have a voltage box. The day that I got there, one of the cables was down, probably because of a shark bite, which is a pretty common occurrence. But the cables are always routed with plenty of redundancy so that if one cable goes down, it doesn't disrupt the entire network. But I did learn that day that in the case that a fiber optic cable does go down, the bandwidth is first cut off to consumers, and there are several passageways for data that basically go between international centers of finance that never get cut off. So here, let me give you a wide view. So this image is the cement bunker where the fiber optic cable comes in from the ocean. Usually the cable is laid underground about 2 miles out from the shore and then routed down through a kind of sewer-like hole into bunkers like these. Let me give you a close-up. So that's it. That's the cable. No wider than a garden hose. And then the cable gets routed through the building to different towers that house the different strands of fiber optic cables. So here's my friend who let me in that day. They were more than happy to show me around after we talked about wine for a little bit. It's easier than one might think. The difficult part is negotiating these things before you leave and also negotiating whether or not you can take photographs within the facility. So I had called several of these companies before I left for my trip to South Africa and received little to no feedback from them, straight up no's via email. And then once I was actually there, it took about a week to get access to these cable landing stations. And with this cable landing station specifically, all I did was call the tourism board in Melkbos, South Africa, and a very kind woman on the phone said, "Oh, that new cement building that came about 5 years ago. Oh, sure, I can give you their direct number." So oftentimes I've found that when you're actually in a place and have traveled from far away, it's not so difficult to access these places, but the hard part is actually including imagery from your trip. So some of these stills made it into the final film, but I was also obligated to not include most of them. So this is an interesting shot. This is, although a little bit fuzzy, there's a program that the people running the fiber optic cable landing station use so that they can see every single ship, registered ship, that's currently on the ocean. So you can see a little triangle for each of those ships, and what this does, you can click on the triangles to get more data about the ship, what the ship is carrying, and who owns it. But what this allows is for the liability in case a fiber optic cable gets severed by a ship, which is very common. The fiber optic cable company knows who to sue, basically. So I'm going to move now. This photo, although retro, is from the second fiber optic cable landing station I went to, which also was the landing point for the first telegraph cable that ever entered South Africa. So there were these really great old photos, and they had a kind of makeshift museum of communication cabling, although not open to the public, so it was a treat to see. But here, sorry again for the fuzzy photo, but here you can see the transition in technology from this older cable that uses copper all the way to the top one. I don't believe any of those are fiber optic, so this would be a history of the different telegraph cables. And here we have a section of, I believe this was also a section from the original telegraph cable that came into South Africa. And this cable, I'm thinking, if I remember correctly, also used the island of Tenerife as a waypoint. So you can see this poster there. And the last photograph, actually I'll show you this one too. Here's a clearer image. Okay, so we can actually see the labels on this image. The top one reads 4-core earth joint. 1,000 lightweight cable joint. So I guess this is a kind of documentation of the different jointing used. But this is a great photograph. So you can see in the background, this is actually the leader of South Africa right after they received the first phone call from Great Britain, and the golden phone upon which they received this phone call. So great little museum to encounter. Also, you know, just a kind of museum of the oddities of years upon years of colonial endeavors. So I can show you a few photographs or a few stills from the film. How am I doing on time? Hello?
Hi, you're fine. You have another 5 minutes if you need. 5-10 minutes if you need.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and so this photograph is, I guess I should preface this by saying, so I oftentimes can't use the images that I collect while I'm in these situations documenting critical infrastructure. So I often try to develop a kind of poetic language of abstraction to accompany the still photographs that I am able to use. So this is a still from one of the last films that I made, and these are Zorbs, so they're inflatable plastic balls that allow you to walk on water, but I often think of them as floating foreign currency rates kind of coming in and out of the sea there. This is a still from the film also. So there is an online massively multiplayer game called, let's see, this is a modification of it. I forget what the whole overarching game is called, but this one is called the Anglo-Zulu War. So a bunch of people get together and reenact in a very violent way this war that's so glorified and present in the media. This next still is of a 35mm slide projector that I used to incorporate the digital imagery, some of which you just saw. So I wanted to use a slide projector and also to play with the kind of didactics of the slide projector. We're used to looking at an image and learning from an image in that context, but I wanted to experiment with duration in addition to this multi-surface focal plane in order to allow the viewer to kind of sink into some form of visual understanding, but to then disrupt that visual understanding. And this is one of the last shots from the film. So this is a pool at Cape Agulhas, which is the southernmost tip of South Africa, where the Portuguese first arrived about 500 years ago. And it's a pool which is created out of these cement-walled bunkers that allows you to swim in the ocean without experiencing the flow of the tide. So I like to think about this pool as a visual metaphor for something similar to what fiber optic cabling does, which is act as a conduit for a massive amount of data flow. And I guess I'll just wrap up by emphasizing the kind of strange phenomenon that occurred for me when I started visiting these fiber optic cable landing stations, which was that I had made the pilgrimage from the United States to South Africa to look at these places, but upon looking at them, you become very aware of the deceptiveness of objects and surfaces. So actually looking at the cabling itself does little to describe the socioeconomic underpinnings of what allowed the cable's presence. So that being a disturbing but also very generative realization, I will be hopefully traveling on a fiber optic cable laying ship going from Luanda, Angola to Fortaleza, Brazil this summer. And well, that's about it. I guess I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Meredith. I guess we'll go on to our next speaker, Bill Maurer.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And some of the things I have to say follow very nicely from what Meredith was just showing us. I'm an anthropologist, and I've been doing research in the British Virgin Islands since the late 1990s. And the BVI is one of the world's most important offshore incorporation centers. There are, at any given time, around 1 million companies incorporated in the BVI, give or take. It's a little different from some of the other offshore jurisdictions that people may be familiar with, such as the Cayman Islands, which is more a banking center, or Bermuda, which is more of an insurance center. And it has a very unique history that's inflected some of the ways that the offshore sector there has developed, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the real point of connection to Meredith's work is that early on in the research that I was doing there, I spent some time looking at the technological infrastructures that facilitated the origin of the offshore financial services business in the BVI, as well as some other territories, British dependent territories in the Caribbean. And they had very much to do with the laying of the first transoceanic telecommunications cables, the copper wires that were strung from the UK to Bermuda and thence to the BVI by the company that was then Cable and Wireless West Indies Limited. And if I can screen share for a second, let's see what happens. Okay. I will just show you this article. I'm not sure if you're able to see the screen.
Yeah, we see the screens.
Okay, and you can see this article, Islands in the Net, that I wrote a number of years ago, looking at this relationship between the way that the early cables were laid and the way that those then helped much later facilitate the rise of finance in the Caribbean. Because one of the key infrastructures that you need to do any kind of financial activity, but particularly offshore, is adequate telecommunications and data capability. And the BVI and a few other places in the Caribbean were uniquely situated because of the way that the cables had initially been laid back in the 19th century. So when Meredith says that there's a colonial legacy here that we need to be attentive to, I'd just like to underscore that in this domain of oops, sorry, I'm just trying to turn off the screen share now, but I'm not sure if that's happening. In this domain of the emergence of offshore finance. And another of the sort of infrastructures that's also very much the legacy of the colonial era has to do with the nature of the common law. Another reason for the popularity of the British Virgin Islands as an offshore incorporation center is that, number one, it's still British dependent territory, and so you'll hear people say that the BVI offers the stability of British law and order. This is something that people have been saying for 20 years now.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. No, we're not. Hello.
Oh no, I should be fine. Okay. Oh, Bill? Yeah, we're just having a few internet connections on this side, so unfortunately we stopped being able to hear you just right after you started talking about Meredith's work in comparison to the colonial.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, but we can hear you now. If you don't mind going back again, I'm so sorry.
No, sure. I'll and you can see me. Everything is fine.
Yeah, we can see you perfectly fine.
So all that I was saying is I was saying that there's a real key connection between some of what Meredith was talking about and some of the work that I've done on the British Virgin Islands and the antecedents of the offshore financial services sector there, which very much have to do with the points at which the first copper cables that were laid across the Atlantic by Cable and Wireless West Indies Limited terminated in some of the Caribbean islands that later became tax havens. Essentially, the kind of communicative infrastructure was there, and there were. Sorry, I'm getting a terrible echo now at this point, but the communicative infrastructure was there that facilitated the later development of the financial services sector, because one of the things that you need in terms of infrastructure to run any kind of financial center is the ability for transoceanic, transcontinental communications and data transfer. So what I was saying before is the first bit of infrastructure necessary for an offshore center are precisely the cables that Meredith was discussing, which have their roots in the 19th century, in the colonial period. And of course, when we're talking about the British Virgin Islands and other British dependent territories now in the Caribbean that serve as offshore finance centers, colonialism is something that's very much in the present, right? These are places that are still British dependent territories. That was the first thing that I had to say about infrastructure. The second thing is that the other piece of colonial infrastructure that very much animates the offshore in the Caribbean is the common law. And you will hear people still today in the BVI who come there to set up trust companies or other kinds of vehicles, offshore vehicles, will say that one of the things that makes the British Virgin Islands very attractive is a tradition of quote-unquote British law and order. And what's being referred to there really is not just the common law and what it allows for incorporation and banking and so on, but also the tradition of equity. And equity is the sort of odd beast in the common law tradition of a set of principles and precepts that are supposed to moderate the letter of the law in the interest of justice, in the interest of justice or fairness. A classic example of a case that would be considered something that would be heard before equity would be a case where inheritance law mandates that everything goes to the firstborn son at someone's death, but the firstborn son was a jerk, and it was the secondborn son who really took care of grandpa in his dotage. The secondborn son could go before a court of equity and say, I know that the law says everything goes to my elder brother, but since I've been the good guy here and I've taken care of my grandfather, I should have a right to the inheritance. And a judge hearing this before a court of equity would likely side with the secondborn. Now, why is this an interesting thing that's kind of important for the offshore today? Well, essentially what you have with a lot of companies that incorporate offshore is a desire for both the stability and security that you get from the common law. And today, a lot of the activity that's taking place in the British Virgin Islands anyway is coming from China, is coming from countries where elites feel potentially politically exposed, in addition to all of the kind of tax avoidance and tax evasion stuff, and often kind of conjoined with tax evasion. But folks who are coming from a place where people often feel that the law will not be there to serve them, so they want British law. But then what they also want when things go wrong is something that's akin to private arbitration. These are business dealings. These are often very complicated business dealings involving lots of partners and lots of countries with lots of subsidiaries. If you can avoid the hard letter of the law, it's in everybody's interests to do so. And a kind of feature of the offshore jurisdictions of the Caribbean, particularly the British Virgin Islands, is that cases can be heard according to principles of equity, as opposed to principles of hard law. So that's another interesting kind of colonial infrastructure and colonial legacy in the way the offshore plays out today. I thought that I would also just say a few words about some of the changes that have been taking place in the offshore Caribbean that are kind of interesting to think about. And again, I'll make an effort here to share my screen for a second and just show you a couple of very abstract maps that I made a couple of years ago that are trying to basically document changes in flows of money for offshore corporations in the BVI. So let me now do this. Hopefully the screen share will work. And let me see if I can show you that. Hopefully you are seeing right now a sort of abstract diagram. What you've got here is a kind of abstract representation of the world. Way over here, this is Hong Kong. This is the Maldives or something. This is Uruguay. Over here are the Americas. All up in here is the UK and Europe. And what this is basically showing is the patterns of incorporation, whereby a lot of the funds for offshore incorporation in 1990, this is a snapshot from 1990, were basically coming through this corridor here across the Atlantic to the BVI. This is sort of the UK, Jersey, Guernsey, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and so on, all incorporating here in the BVI. A little bit of stuff in the US and Canada and so on, but this was your main kind of channel with a big kind of stretch way out there to Hong Kong, and just a little bit of stuff happening in South Asia. And forgive me, actually, this over here, this other big chunk is Central America. There was a lot of Panamanian money that was coming in the 90s. And now let's sort of fast forward a bit to 2009. And you've got a much more complicated pattern, but you can see that this kind of river coming from Europe has shrunk a little bit, and there's this new big river coming from Asia, a little bit more from South America. The Central America stuff is pretty much dwindling. But this really is the story now about the use of offshore jurisdictions in the Caribbean. It's really a story about a rising China and a rising India, and about the use of offshore structures for subsidiary incorporation by Chinese and Indian businessmen and entrepreneurs. So just to sort of see that contrast, again, we sort of go from this world. I think of this as kind of the high modern world of the offshore. This is the kind of, James Bond era financial crime and narco money and rich people high net worth individuals who are seeking a safe haven for their funds in the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, mainly being about Europeans and some wealthy Central Americans. Contrast that again with this. This to me is kind of the multipolar world, the creating of a kind of postmodern economy that's bringing in more south-south flows that are also being routed through the Caribbean for a number of reasons that I'd be happy to discuss later. But that's the kind of thing that we're seeing much more of today. A lot of Chinese firms incorporating in the British Virgin Islands, as well as more and more from South Asia. Just give me one moment here to come back to my screen. So that gives you a little overview of the infrastructures of the offshore and their colonial legacies. It also gives you a little bit of an overview of the shifting geography of the offshore. I guess I'd like to just close by asking the question in this forum and with these other participants, why it is that the offshore is so interesting to art, right? Because this is not the only conversation like this that's taking place right now. There's quite a few folks in all domains of art and literature and drama who have been thinking about the offshore. Golden and Seneby have just released the book Headless by K.D., the author is K.D., which is a kind of fictional author who's created this mystery novel that was initially serialized by the artist's golden incentive. What is it that is so compelling about these kind of hyperreal spaces of virtualization, which at the same time we see is completely dependent upon and saturated by all kinds of legacy infrastructures, not just the fiber optic cables, but even the copper ones that are still down there at the bottom of the Atlantic, not just the internet, but still very much the fax machine, because even in the world of the offshore, we still need representations of wet signatures on some documents, not just the thumb drive, right, that gets leaked from the BVI, exposing a lot of the activities of people who were incorporating there, but also these binders, these giant 3-ring books that are this thick, which you'll have boxes and boxes and boxes of being hauled to the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court whenever there's a case involving an offshore company. Just mountains and mountains and mountains of paper. There's a kind of very thick materiality of the offshore, which together with its virtualization, I think makes it quite compelling for various kinds of people to think with. So I'll leave off at that question about art, and turn it back to you folks. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. And that question, I think, will be something that comes up especially tomorrow. Actually, Angus Cameron, who is sort of the acting representation of Golden Incentive, is actually speaking in tomorrow's panel. So I hope we'll take it up a little bit today in the discussion, but definitely tomorrow too. So I'll pass it on to our 2 first respondents. Who wants to go first, Suhail or Victoria?
Hi. Okay, so as has been mentioned already, my name is Victoria Benova. I'm actually a former colleague of Robert and Kat. I also graduated from CCS last year, and sort of just to explain why I think I've been asked here last minute is because my research also intersects with questions of offshore, but more from perspective of finance and financial infrastructures, and how can financial infrastructures be thought of constructively from within the field of contemporary art. After hearing all the presentations, I just wanted to perhaps tie some of these points together in order to establish common ground for discussion that could hopefully be launched after all the presentations. And I think one thing that really sort of resonated with me is the manner in which we've been talking about fiber optic systems, or the technological infrastructure, as literally the infrastructure that has enabled the existence of offshore and sort of its use value to the current form of global capitalism. This resonates a lot with the work that Keller Easterling has been doing recently in a book that she has published called Extra Statecraft. I think most of you have heard of it. There she takes up the notion of the zone, which obviously intersects with the notion of the offshore in many important ways. So the zone, traditionally is kind of considered as a free trade zone, as an incentive for business optimization, for people to, or for companies and people to be able to land or embed their businesses with their manufacturing processes within these supposedly exceptional spatial spaces, in order to have higher profits. And tying this back to discourse on kind of colonialism, neocolonialism, post-colonialism, of course, this has been a very effective way, supposedly effective way, for new developing countries to jumpstart their economies. And in fact, there has been the zone, or kind of the offshore paradigm, although it wasn't called such, has been advocated by the UN and actually kind of forcefully lobbied for, in many new developing countries that were formed in the 60s and the 70s. But I think what's really interesting about Easterling's account of the zone is that instead of stating that it is an exception, she asks us to actually consider how the zone has proliferated across the globe, has multiplied in forms, and can actually be seen as the rule. So instead of being kind of the shadow economy, it is in fact the kind of backbone of the current global socioeconomic and political order. So, and the zone is characterized, as was said, by business optimization. And, that sounds neutral, but of course what comes at the expense of business optimization are all the things that we kind of don't like, which is, bad conditions for labor, very little money going into public infrastructure, most money just being siphoned back into private bank accounts. So actually there's a way in which, what is being depleted is not just the space, but society in general. So once again, Easterling kind of comes with, let's say, positive twist on the entire zone story and says, well, what are other sort of means by which the zone is being constructed apart from these financial rules? And she locates kind of architecture and design as a potential avenue for activist intervention. So she calls kind of design and architecture kind of vigilant, in which it is an active form and a multiplier, because the way that it is positioned within these different environments is actually in a very generic type manner. So kind of in a rather idealistic way, I think she hopes that we can use this logic of the active form, the multiplier, which is necessarily connected to global infrastructure, in order to hack its value system and to potentially remove it. So I wanted to bring this back to conversation art, and I think Bill Maurer asked a very good question as to, why is offshore interesting to art? And I have a very cynical answer, which is, contemporary art is always seeking new territories that are in, and, kind of offshore and finance are in, so we're interested in that. But I think the more interesting, so of course there are less cynical versions of that answer, but I think the more interesting question could also be how is that interest actually being pursued? And it seems that most attempts to sort of investigate offshores, the socioeconomic structures of zones, finance, etc., from the field of contemporary art come as a result of this kind of desire to represent, to understand, and to critique. So the way that happens is usually on a level of ad hoc investigation, which kind of takes the tropes of that field and kind of remolds them within the vocabulary of the transnational contemporary art speak. And I'd like to kind of position this provocation that this is actually insufficient, and that if we really want to intervene into these infrastructures with an active agenda, we need to follow more kind of in line of what Keller Easterling calls kind of hacking the active form. So I think the super interesting question is like, how do we actually do that? How do we do it as cultural agents from a field that doesn't really have a knowledge system of its own, but that's constantly intervening into other systems? So perhaps that's the question that I'd like to pose later in the discussion to the two artists who have kindly presented their projects, Yuri and Meredith. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, I'm Sahel. I teach here at CCS. I want to counterpoint two comments made. One by Meredith, when she talked about the deceptiveness of objects and surfaces, which seemed to kind of express something of frustration about the projects that she was showing, in which the demonstration and display of wires and the material infrastructure doesn't quite account for what that system sort of makes, essentially, as a system. And I want to contrast that with, or kind of bring that into contact with what Bill just mentioned at the end of his presentation about the thick materiality of the offshore, which is exactly the same set of wires and rooms and warehouses and the rest of it. And maybe through that contrast speak to Bill's question about art's interest, but I think hopefully go beyond that as well. What I'm quite struck by recently is a kind of pronounced interest in the material infrastructure of the offshore. We can think of Deborah Cohen's book on logistics and shipping containers, the works of Yuri and Meredith, as we've seen today. A book by Alberto Toscano and Jeff Kinkle on ports and infrastructures, Keller Easterling's work that Victoria's just mentioned, Nicholas Daraskevsky's recent book on offshore cables as well. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around which kind of tries to show us that the offshore or the kind of global infrastructures are materially constructed and are therefore fragile, subject to degradation, attacks, intervention, shark bites, and the rest of it. And somehow the attempt of this kind of work is to say for all of the symbolic and abstract complexity of globalization, from finance through to insurance, through to ownership structure, basically kind of sort of capitalist global infrastructure, all of it depends upon material conditions. And these material conditions are vulnerable, and also they can be experienced by being in a room, taking a photograph, and a kind of sensorial presence, if you want. But to come back to Meredith's question, what I think needs investigation is why this emphasis on the materiality of global infrastructures, why this emphasis on the materiality, in this case, of the offshore, rather than the kind of systemic action of the offshore. And I wonder if there are two things going on here. Firstly, it's certainly a way to concretize what are generally abstract processes that we encounter more through the shuffling of bank accounts in Bill's diagrams that he was showing at the end, the kind of schema and representations of where companies are kind of instituting themselves, incorporating. Thank you. Yeah, where companies are incorporating and so on. These are sort of legal, juridical manifestations, and yes, they exist on paper, but somehow paper isn't quite the legal entity itself. The legal entity is the company, the BVI, which is operating in China or Europe or wherever. So on the one hand, the presence, the materiality of the offshore somehow grounds these processes, but also fails to capture those processes in what they produce. And there's something in that materialization, but also therefore a kind of failure to capture or a kind of inadequacy to what is produced by that materiality, which I think needs to be investigated. And for that reason, I think I'm a little suspicious about the emphasis on materiality. It sort of seems an effort to re-experientialize at the level of the sensorial body, sight, sound, installations, if you want, something that actually just has that as a background condition, and is not at core about those conditions, those material conditions. So there's a question about the. I have a question about the emphasis on the experiential setup in a way of figuring or presenting an image for the offshore. Because the difficulty, of course, is the offshore is a large, abstract, integrated, multi-regional blah, blah, blah. How do you image it? And one way to image it is just to look at the rooms and the wires and the rest of it, but that doesn't seem to be quite enough. And the reason it seems to me not quite enough is for the second issue, which I want to raise, which is around the interesting point that Bill raised about the interest in stability and security, which is why Chinese companies go to the BVI and others as well. What's surprising about that is that the common sort of critical cultural studies sort of discussion about contemporary globalization as an abstract field is about destabilization. Right? So symbolic capital, financial capital is kind of flowing from one part to the other very fast, high frequency trading, volatilities, blah, blah. All of these structures seem to kind of suggest instabilities within the structure, which is a condition for capitalization through volatility, but also the kind of destabilization of territorial integrity, the kind of destabilization in a way of like the kind of standard modern conditions for citizenship, subjecthood, and the rest of it. One has kind of strong long-term commitments to this or that region, these or that people. That's kind of up in the air now. So for all of the cultural and critical studies discussion about globalization as instability, what we see through the charts that Bill was presenting, the discussion is actually the corporations want stability. They want security in terms of legal structures, and that's a driver for offshoring. So I think what I'm sort of struggling with a little bit, and I'm trying to think this out as I'm speaking, is what's the what's the discrepancy between the kind of broad cultural view of global instabilities and the kind of legal emphasis on stability and security, which is completely understandable. And of course, you need legal stability qua corporation in order to kind of generate volatilities qua financial institution that you can then take profits from. So the two aren't disconnected or in contradiction. One relies on the other. And just two quick comments around that. I think one, to go back to the question of experience and the emphasis on experience, it's clear that offshoring as an example of global infrastructures and their mobilization is a manifestation of what in the critical literature is called real abstractions. The real abstractions, not on the level of the subject, which is where the Marxist literature comes from, but real abstractions at the level of objective infrastructures. And the effort to present experiential descriptions of those real abstractions, which is the rooms and cables and the rest of it, are ways to kind of move the real back into the material. But again, I'm not clear, or it seems to me, I'll be more certain, it seems to me that the effort to rematerialize or to present a material image of those real abstraction kind of somehow is inadequate to what's being produced at the level of the abstraction. Because it's just about what's in the room rather than what that cable permits in terms of the global world condition. And the second point, just to wrap up, is that the general sense, I think, about the conditions of global real abstraction is one of dislocation and decentering. And again, I think the risk of the material, or the what we'll call the thick materiality of the offshore, and drawing attention to that, is that that dislocation and decentering kind of gets recentered in terms of the experiential encounter with the material conditions. But also that the dislocation and decentering is in a way, what's the word I'm after? The question is, what would be the best way to present an image of that dislocated and decentered condition, right, of the global infrastructure? And actually, I think the answer somewhere is in the diagram, sort of schemes that Bill was setting up. It seems to me that with the diagram, which is kind of an abstract, kind of visualization of an abstractly determined process. It's a chart. You do get a way of sensorially presenting and making available for comprehension through an image something at the level of the real abstraction itself, right? Not at the level of the material conditions. So I think those are my comments. I can formulate them into more precise questions, but I've already said that.
Okay, so I thought since a lot of this has sort of rested back on art, that maybe Meredith, you'd like to respond first to some of this, and then maybe we can pass it on to Bill before taking some questions, since I imagine quite a few things came up from both Suhail and Victoria. So Meredith, I don't know if you have any response.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot about the kind of trend or obsession with documenting infrastructure that's happening in contemporary art, and it both fascinates me and kind of scares me, because I do think in just documenting infrastructure you're missing the point. And so I liked towards the end of the last speaker's comments this kind of bringing up the diagram as a possible alternative to just the creation of sensorial experience. I oftentimes think about the diagram as kind of having the same modernist dilemma of looking at a map and being able to visually conquer a wide kind of territory. It's like you're provided power through the gestalt of a diagram that I think the experiential kind of usurps that power in a way. So ideally, I think a combination of this kind of diagrammatic thinking with the sensorial elements of audiovisual experience, like we see the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab doing, obviously, is a great happy medium. And another thing I wanted to respond to, just in terms of what I view the role of culture to be in this whole phenomenon of offshoring, is I think a lot about the complexity of these projects, the complexity of giving audiovisual form to a diagram of sorts and doing justice to the complexity of these phenomena. And I think about the role of the artist today, which is, I think, kind of runs counter to that, which is that many artists are putting out a lot of work all the time and required to operate within this kind of cultural speed that undermines the ability of a lot of cultural producers to approach things with adequate complexity. So I would like to see longer form works that really do try to take these issues on. And then the last thing, oh, I think I already, yeah, I guess that's all I'll say for now.
Meredith, sorry. We've just lost connection with our main computer again, so I lost you right after you started describing the role of the artist today.
Oh.
Do you mind retracing your steps? I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll do it more eloquently this time. Yeah, it was just that I think that sort of approaching the complexity of a lot of these concepts of offshoring, or, you know, like tracing a network completely, is an endeavor that takes a really long period of time, and I think the speed and rate at which culture is moving today contests many artists' ability and desire to engage on that level. So I would like to see longer form work being made about these issues that does achieve a kind of balance of the experiential and the diagrammatic that we've been talking about. And I will make one argument for the kind of experiential audiovisual, which is that I think a lot about Lazzarato's notion of immaterial labor and the presence of bodies in space, giving people some sort of entry point into the work, and also an ability to have a political relationship or a political stake to the work through the identification of other lives. So I would say, in addition to, let's add the diagram to the audiovisual sensorial, but on top of that, also add the presence of human bodies to this phenomenon of documenting infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Meredith.
Sure.
I'm going to pass it off to Bill to see if he has any comments on what you just said or respondents.
It's a really fascinating set of reflections and ideas on the table now. I mean, I think that for me, one of the reasons why I do find compelling thinking about and attending to these materialities is that it helps to identify some of the past dependencies that were laid down, you know, in earlier eras, and that we still are basically running in the tracks of. And you know, when I look at these things, I see very much still the legacy of the imperial age, the British imperial age. And, you know, it's really quite, there's something quite profound about the success, you know, I put this in quotation marks, but the success of empire in that period, to the point where we're still, with everything else that's happened, you know, in the world, we're still basically going down some of the same tracks. That's the first point. But it's closely related to a second point, which is that realization leads me to start asking questions about what are the rails that are being built now, right? What are some of the new pathways that are going to be that are being created now that may have that same kind of lasting and durable legacy, or does the world just not work that way anymore, right? Have we kind of gone beyond a world where it's even possible to think and act on the kind of unified planetary scale that that empire attempted? And, you know, one is used to these sort of critiques of of empire that emphasized empire's fragility, the always in making, always in process aspects of the imperial project, and that's all great, and yet stuff worked, right? And there's stuff that worked that still works, and I mean that in a completely, you know, sort of superficial way of things continue to function, and it's really quite remarkable that they do. So you know, even the cable that gets bit by the shark, right? The communications pathways are still going to be reopened at some point, or things are still going to go, which makes some of the, you know, recent moments of disruption quite fascinating. And I'm thinking of, you know, the stuff that happened around the Arab Spring in Egypt. I'm thinking about some of the experimentation with and on infrastructure that took place in various locations during Occupy. I'm thinking about the way that, you know, a host of activist communities have taken up explicitly infrastructural projects, both because of their fragility, but also because of infrastructure's ability to create durable and lasting paths. So, you know, I guess I'm really interested in this question of pathways, path dependencies, and durabilities, and whether, as a kind of critical practice, we can be thinking about our own role in, you know, rewiring, hacking, creating anew some of these things for you know, the kinds of futures that we can imagine.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. I think we'll open it up to anyone in the audience here who has any questions. If you want to come up and ask them. Oh.
They can come closer to me.
Or they can sit over there too.
This is a follow-up on what Bill was just saying about reminiscence of the empires and how that is still influencing the offshore works, its infrastructures. I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the role of the private, actually, and how the private is creating these new empires, because the relations, fiber optic cables, ownership on them. It's not only nations anymore, and many times, but investments that create them. So how does that form these new empires, and how it affects economies of the offshore areas?
Bill, sorry, give us a second. Your mic defaulted for 2 seconds. Got it?
There we go.
Now it works. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, hear you perfectly.
Good. Okay. No, that was a terrific question. You know, some of the work that I've been doing recently is looking at the creation of private payment infrastructure. So private rails for transiting value, much like, you know, the Visa network or the MasterCard network, but that are now, you know, there's a proliferation of such private systems right now. A lot of them are, you know, involved in things like the so-called sharing economy, right, where Braintree is a payments platform that's private, that sits behind Airbnb and Uber and you know, a lot of our you know, quote-unquote sharing economy companies. Braintree in turn is owned by PayPal, right? So where we once could speak of means of value transfer that were provided largely through state infrastructures or partnerships between the state and private entities, we're fast, you know, approaching a world of a proliferation of private providers of the infrastructures of payment. And one of the reasons that's interesting to me is that some of the conversation, at least in the industry, is starting to slip from we're just providing an infrastructure for the transit of value to we are providing an alternative token of value, right? Slipping from we're just building the railroad tracks to we are building a new money, right? We will disintermediate money itself from the state and loosen up the state's hold of the monopoly of the means of exchange. That's a really interesting thing, right? I mean, to me, again, it recalls our 19th century. I mean, in the United States, there was a whole era of wildcat banking where there was a whole number of private currencies that were issued before the Bank Act, and then the Federal Reserve standardized the currency and brought it fully under the purview of the state. I think that we are seeing a kind of great game taking place right now, and that all of the EU's battles with Google and other entities like Google are a manifestation of this great game between states and the providers of the essential infrastructures of communication and data transfer. This is sort of a game that's still not over. People, sort of a standard economist would say something like, what's the concern? There's actually competition. It's not just Google, it's Google, Facebook, Amazon, right, ... But at the same time, it's all of those things together with progressive, ongoing disinvestment in the state and state infrastructures, some of which is aided and abetted by the kind of capital flight that the offshore can facilitate, as well as the revenue drain, the tax drain that the offshore can represent. That's particularly acute in some countries in the global south, where wealthy elites, will routinely park their money elsewhere for the purposes of evading the revenue collector of their country, and that's a serious problem. So, I think that bringing to the table this question of public versus private, it really raises a host of important questions for anyone thinking about the offshore or the current moment in general.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
I have a question to Hale, and that's just along the lines of what Meredith was saying, is bringing together both the diagram and the experience. And I'm not proposing that you are saying that you see a dichotomy between the two, but do you see potential at all for a joint between the two practices can you experience the diagram, or must it be separated?
I wasn't prepared to be asked a question, so certainly the diagram presents something to cognition through the sense. It's not like without a sensorial material base. One has a diagram. I think the issue is more of the image of global infrastructures, in this case through the offshore, and what gets us closer to the truth of infrastructure. And there's a sense in which, because of an emphasis on corporeal experience as the aesthetics and sensorial, and what is called sort of the audiovisual there's a sense in which that seems to suggest and then, yeah, it's an emphasis on material conditions, and I think Bill kind of talked about that in terms of the path dependencies that are built in to those material conditions. So conditions aren't accident; they generate the infrastructure we have now, and with kind of the economic and political structures for offshoring rely upon those kind of imperial pathways. But none of those are imperial pathways at the time of communication and cognitive capacities, which aren't the ones that we currently occupy. So my concern is that if we concentrate on the image of what the stuff looks like and what pipes look like, rooms they come into, and the sharks and the rest of it, it kind of domesticates. It sort of sensorially domesticates what's happened structurally and what's produced infrastructurally. And that it's been produced infrastructurally, which to me, as a total interest, as in many other things that art deals with, it's what's produced structurally drive of models of investment and infrastructural production, which I think is what Victoria is asking about in her question. So I think the question I sort of want to juju it back to the is that if the original point or if the point I don't do juju, so I don't actually know what I'm looking about again. If the point that Bill is making and that sort of Meredith brings to us very forcibly is that the current infrastructural conditions are coming legacies, like the grandfather by the technological material structures of empire. Is it all the case that the development of infrastructures is led by those material conditions, or is it being led by operation, which then generate forms of material infrastructure? So in a way, are the kind of forms of accumulation which are now prevalent. You describe some of them in terms of monetary disintermediation. There are, of course, many others. Is that a thing that now drives material infrastructure development and reorganization? And also, I guess, for Meredith, that which would, if it is that it's the abstract processes which drives, what does one do as a presenting? Oh, I don't understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'd have to
summarize it.
Okay. Robin, are you able to? Right now? Ah, okay. Sorry, I totally lost it.
Okay.
Totally lost.
I mean, I can repeat.
Fine, if you could, because what's eating is right. Try with the mic.
So, is this more comprehensible?
Can you hear clearly?
No.
Okay. But can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Hi, Bill. Okay, so my question was, and this question I asked Meredith as well, is that you're emphasizing how the kind of imperial legacy is the condition for the construction of contemporary offshoring. And I understand that in terms of the historical development of where we are now, and in a way a kind of good reason for kind of infrastructure models that we currently we can't have. But is it the case that what's generated by these global infrastructural mechanisms and constructions now in turn drives new infrastructural practices and infrastructural material organization, right? So it's kind of the difference between where we are for historical reasons, producing the conditions we have now, which is global infrastructure, and in your case, specialism through offshoring. But given that we're here now, and there's further developments of infrastructural mediations and intermediations, as you were describing, is it the global infrastructures which drive new material? I follow up to the question about private ownership of the cables. Is it the case that those interesting forms of accumulation are having new non-imperial types of material infrastructure? And then the question I had in relationship to that, to Meredith, was that if it is the abstract construction of accumulation, essentially, that's driving new material conditions, like how do we think about presenting images of that? That's it.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. It's just so difficult for me to hear everything, and things cut out and come back in again, and then there's reverb. But so it's still quite a challenge to kind of figure out everything that you were just saying. And I apologize. There's it's just the sort of, here we are talking about communicative infrastructures and having kind of a very interesting moments of breakdown here and there with them. But let me just say something, to take a contemporary example that may speak to some of what you're getting at. From the point of view of a private provider of payment services today, right? So if I'm PayPal, what I want more than nothing else is for there to be a publicly built, maintained, and maintained infrastructure for me to parasite off of. Because if I know that it's going to do the basic job of getting value from A to B, and I don't have to build it and I don't have to maintain it, then I can create a kind of private gateway into it that maybe has some added service attached to it, or some user-friendly something or other, that then justifies my charging an additional fee for it. That's the business case for a PayPal, and this is this is how PayPal works. The business case for PayPal is basically sitting on top of the publicly mandated infrastructure of the automated clearinghouse, which is a thing that's majority owned by the Federal Reserve and is a public-private partnership, blah, blah, blah. Has a very long, interesting history. What PayPal does is just basically, quote unquote, ride the rails of the ACH. And that phrase, riding the rails, is the phrase that people in the payments industry use to talk about sitting on top of somebody else's infrastructure. So, that's the kind of the name of the game, at least in terms of the transit of value today. The name of the game is sort of sitting on top of, or parasiting, or riding the rails of other public infrastructures, and not necessarily trying to privatize them or enclose them, but to create private gateways into them, or little subsystems or sub-enclosed systems that will kind of keep circuits of capital moving within a particular loop and not getting away from you. So that's one of the senses in which those older infrastructures really come to matter. And there are places in the world, of course, where out of whole cloth, private entities are building all the infrastructure for everything. But in large swaths of the world, particularly in the global north, there is a patchwork of these legacy infrastructures, many of which were publicly created and are still publicly maintained. And even if we start to think we're seeing their privatization, very often there's still a backbone that's not, and that's really interesting to me. This sort of subterranean, public that's still there. Like, to use one of the examples that I write about, like money itself, which is still in itself a public good, right? We don't have private currencies so much the way that we used to, although there are moves toward that in a number of quarters. I'm not quite sure if that's getting at what Sohail is raising, but hopefully there's enough points of contact there to keep the conversation going.
Can we go over to myths? I think definitely those bring up the idea and their histories, and that Meredith's actually touches on that, and actually to this idea of visualization, but also mobilizing it to this moment experience is her personal experience. I know that we have a number of questions from. Maybe we want to transition to hear from the audience. Meredith, do you mind? I'm going to switch to you for a bit. Yeah, sure.
So just to respond to the question that was asked 2 presenters ago, I think a lot about the importance of not simplifying the abstract through a documentation of only the material. I'm also very freaked out about this new trend of object-oriented ontology, and I don't believe in it at all. I don't know if that's happening in the art circles you all are involved in, or maybe just in mine. But I think it's a really slippery slope to only image apparatuses, because it almost gives the viewer a false answer or a false justification for something that is more complex. So two ways I like to think about complicating the documentation or presencing of infrastructure are both looking at the publicity that surrounds a lot of the mega projects that I research, because oftentimes the publicity and the kind of global idea of what the project will achieve is released 2 to 3 years before the laying of the actual cable. So with at least 3 or 4 cables that I've researched in the past, I've had permission to, say, get onto a fiber optic cable laying ship, which I've been trying to do for several years, but then I'll find out later that the plan for the cable is actually tabled. So the negotiating of these transnational contracts is incredibly complicated, but there's always some type of entirely globally connected world ideology behind it. For a long time there was a lot of talk circulating about BRICS cable, which would connect all of the BRICS economies, how it was expected that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa would somehow get along enough to facilitate such a project was baffling to me. But actually at the last BRICS summit, there was a public announcement made about this cable, and also that this cable would provide the financial infrastructure for an alternate to the World Bank. So there's a lot of pie-in-the-sky kind of ideology that can be really interesting, and a way of keeping the abstraction as part of the infrastructural conversation. But then the other thing is that as much as these cables are, the proliferation of these cables is driven by abstraction, it's also driven just by the lack of fiber connectivity in any specific region. So it's not just linking global centers of finance, it's bringing fiber to areas that don't have fiber in order to make any money possible through the proliferation of communication networks. So there is a very material aspect to that kind of drives the proliferation of these cables as well. And then the other alternative I think about is always just tracing the path of a commodity, which I think we were seeing a lot maybe 10 years ago, but is becoming increasingly difficult as the physicality of the commodity is kind of leaving in favor of these forms of payment that Bill is talking about, and also just the mammoth of futures and options trading. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Robin, do you have anything to add? Because otherwise, to ask.
Burning question. Let's go.
And carrying on from where this conversation has come, I am actually curious about the question of obscurity and sometimes what these types of abstractions do. Just things that we have talked about and skirted around. Can I just make sure that everyone can hear, or everyone do me a favor? Can you unmute your mic? Robin, unmute yours. We're having an issue with connectivity. Sorry. Is everyone okay there? And so, is yours muted? Yeah, you're still muted. Sorry, Bill. You'll need to unmute yours because for some reason I can't. I've lost access to controls. If you could unmute your mic, I'm very sorry. All right. So Meredith is also unmute. So everyone's sort of like unmuted at this point, except on our side, we'll sort of my system will represent. This is the other networks right here. So back to the question of obscurity that I actually wanted to talk about, and that I feel like we're all sort of skirting around. One thing that with regards to the question of offshore and going back to Bill's first question, what is the interesting that the art world has offshore? I mean, represents sort of these global configurations that I wonder, because they're almost presented as abstractions of sort of unscaled vision of the world. What is the utility of actually obscurity around? And what I mean by that is in offshore narratives, the narrative of the twin, for example, and sort of the transparency that, and Insanity, for example, picks up a very more sort of narrative of obscurity, proxy coming, speaking in place of war. And I'm curious, does this question of obscurity that the art world seems to play with more in abstraction than the world that play out in the discourse of offshore? Like, how obscure is the offshore, and still is it obscure? That's the thing. For the artist, is what are the uses of these types of obscurities or these different obscurities? Yeah.
The question is really is about sort of the narrative of obscurity and the uses of different kinds of obscurity. Okay.
Sorry, girl. Sorry, we lost the connection again on our one computer.
Okay.
Okay.
I can say a few things about obscurity.
Okay.
Okay, please do.
All right. So let me just tell you two little stories. One is that back in the day, let's just say the 80s or 90s, when you were going to incorporate offshore, what you would do, and this is from my field work then, what you would do generally is you would create a really complicated structure that involved lots and lots of little shell companies all strung together, where you'd have one that would be like a 51% owner of a next one that would be owned 49% by something else. That one would be owned 30% by some company somewhere in Switzerland, which itself would be owned 25% by someone else, blah, blah, blah. You get this whole complicated mess. And if a forensic accountant were to try to diagram it, they would just end up having everything looped around in circles, right? The point of creating that kind of mess was to basically hide or conceal beneficial ownership, conceal the ultimate owner or set of owners of the various interlinked enterprises, presumably to get something done, right? Either for the purposes of tax evasion, which is the obvious thing, or for a more kind of strategic, business-oriented reason. And by that, I would mean something like the way that companies would incorporate offshore during the period of the boycott against South Africa during the apartheid regime, where you create all of these complicated nested structures to basically invest in South Africa, right? And anyone looking at it wouldn't be able to figure out what was going on or who actually owned it. So that was very much an explicit practice of obscurity, of creating creating layers upon layers upon layers between an imagined future auditor, investigator, FBI agent or whatever, and whatever you were trying to do. Fast forward to now. Very often what you see today, particularly with Chinese incorporation offshore, is an unbelievably straightforward structure where you have a company in the BVI that owns a company in the Cayman Islands that owns a company in China, right? Just 3 boxes, 1, 2, 3. In the interviews that I did in the 2010, 2011, with forensic accountants who were puzzling over these, a lot of them would literally like say to me, this looks so straightforward that I have no idea what's going on, right? It looks so clear that I have no idea what they're actually up to. Because these are folks who were used to trying to untangle these complicated messes who are now just seeing box, box, box. And it turns out that what that box, box, box is all about is a Chinese company that wants to have ownership formally in the BVI for various kinds of reasons having to do with, either taxation or regulation or protection of intellectual property very often. So the IP of your company is actually held by this entity in a British jurisdiction, not in China. And the reason why they incorporate in the BVI is because they want access to that common law tradition of equity. The reason why they next incorporate in the Caymans is because they want access to the US stock markets. The reason then why they own the thing back in China is to make a Chinese company look like it's not a Chinese company. And it really is completely straightforward. So I just sort of submit that as an interesting thing that's taken place where something that used to be all about the business of obscurity now is about something else. That's my first story. My second story is there's a political economy scholar named Jason Sharman who's written a lot on the offshore and has done some wonderful, wonderful research. And one of his recent projects involved attempting to incorporate in a number of jurisdictions around the world. He himself did this with varying degrees of shadiness, right? Like he would send an email or a letter that would be very scant on details, or would say, I'm working on behalf of a client in the Middle East, and I don't want to tell you more because he's, politically controversial and whatever, right? He would sort of make up these various templates for the people on whose behalf he was supposedly wanting to incorporate. And it turned out in the course of this research project that the places that didn't give him any trouble at all were in the United States, right? So our onshore, offshore jurisdictions like Delaware were a lot more lax and willing to accept obscurity than the offshore jurisdictions of the Caribbean, for instance, which asked for identity documentation or asked for verification of who his client was and so on and so forth. It makes for a fascinating study, but also a really kind of sobering reminder that a lot of the things that we identify with the offshore are happening right in the United States without so much as a look by federal regulators or others.
Yeah, to Meredith.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating answer. Thank you. Another something that kind of underpins, that's very real, that underpins the current project that I'm working on, pertains to a slide that was released on the Glenn Greenwald Laura Poitras blog maybe 6 months ago. But it was an NSA leaked slide from Snowden, and it shows all of the fiber optic pathways that are tapped by the NSA and those that aren't. And Brazil and South Africa both lie outside of those pathways. And in addition, I'm sure most of you know, but after the Snowden incident, shall we call it, the Brazilian Prime Minister was very angry that we had been eavesdropping. So she had a vested interest in creating a fiber optic cable that goes directly from Brazil to Portugal. So once again, we're following these kind of historical pathways, but doing it through a kind of propaganda that is reminiscent or maybe similar to what was happening with I don't know, the arms race in the Cold War, trying to achieve different communication technologies first. So, I mean, we all know that the internet doesn't actually work that way. You can't just circumvent one cable for another. So actually building this cable from Brazil to Portugal won't do anything to stop the beast that is the NSA. So I guess, you know, I think visualizing infrastructure or documenting infrastructure without humans is something that leads to the problematics of its obscurity or its kind of quiet poetics that can kind of lead to a sort of frustration with that aesthetic as it occurs in art. But another reason that happens is because any of the humans involved with operating this machinery or these stations will refuse to be filmed at all. So there is a really delicate balance between abstraction, obscurity, and the presence of human bodies. Oftentimes this cabling is driven by these larger geopolitical concerns, and then when the opportunity comes to image them, all of the psyches that are involved in those concerns kind of run out of the frame. Yeah.
So, hi. So it's come up again and again that in some ways the most straightforward means of representing the offshore are the most obscure, whether it's in the graph or what I really want to ask about is Meredith's experience of traveling to find these cables, and then you expressed a certain sense of underwhelm that I don't really want to take for granted. I would love to hear more about that because in a way it kind of operates like a fable, like the shark that cut the cable or the golden telephone, but it is also a very sort of straightforward representation. So I was hoping you would speak more about that.
Got some feedback. Okay, I'll start over. So there's a huge difficulty in making transnational phenomenon sensible. And so just having, let's see, where should I start? The underwhelmingness of going to these fiber optic cable landing stations in South Africa, I think, has become the impetus for this future project to involve as many people as I can, and also to bring the larger kind of abstract concepts into the work. I'm very hesitant to use kind of graphic visualization within my work, and I do feel pretty connected to cinema in that way. But I think there's something very uncanny about seeing an object that, I mean, it's almost like being in Cape Agulhas and seeing the cross of Bartolomeu Diaz, the first Portuguese explorer that arrived there. You see, I guess in the same way I think about a lot of this fiber optic infrastructure as having the same kind of hollowness of a monument or relating to the object in that kind of way. An interesting side note, when I arrived at the first cable landing station, the man operating the station was Portuguese, so it was a kind of full circle colonialism moment. But yeah, I think that the kind of uncanny experience of seeing something that's responsible for transmitting such a large amount of data that keeps transnational business afloat is an impetus or a call to somehow go beyond just the infrastructure, whether it be through abstraction, the inclusion of labor, the inclusion of people, and landscape that exists along these pathways. And I think a presenter brought that up earlier, referencing a theorist and talking about the possibility of using architecture as political intervention, which I'll stop there.
Okay. So I think I just wanted to press a little bit more, Meredith, on that in terms of, you mentioned earlier in your presentation about sort of your use of poetics. Do you see your next iteration sort of continuing with that poetics as a way of getting around some of the not to use these images, or finding a way of navigating around that and getting out of the poetics?
I think I'll definitely. Okay, can you hear me? Definitely in the next project, I will also be using the kind of poetics that I've relied on in the last few pieces. I'm also hoping to have a closer, less restricted access to the infrastructure, so fingers crossed that I will be able to board this ship that departs from Luanda and then arrives in Fortaleza. And in addition, I'm looking into the historical legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and also I'm very interested in bringing up those histories and also contemporary African diasporic communities into the work as well.
We're just going to pass it over to Victoria, who has another question.
I've got a question for Bill. I really like your example where you sort of showed how the reason for incorporating offshore, has transformed since the 80s. And so what seems, the shift that seems to have elicited this transformation is very much tied to the conditions that particular jurisdictions have found themselves in the 80s and the 90s, and then, now in the 2010s, etc. So I wonder whether this kind of the jurisdictional ideological shifts are actually also kind of very important in understanding the offshore, or like the meaning of the offshore, just as, let's say, the technological material transformations, and that perhaps by sort of putting too much emphasis on the material technological and on its kind of ties to imperial heritage, we're actually not really, understanding to the full potential the sort of more concrete socio-political, for the lack of a better word, transformations that are occurring, of course, in tandem with the technological transformations, but that are actually more attached to ideology as such than to the material transformations.
All right, Bill, you're good to go.
You're still muted.
Oh.
There we go.
Yeah, you're good to go, Bill.
Okay. I should preface that by just pointing out that I sort of underscored some of the infrastructural aspects of the offshore because today's focus was supposed to be on those infrastructures. But and one could sort of talk too about the role of jurisdiction, not in the kind of spatial sense, but in the sense of the place from which the law emanates, as implicit in some of the stuff that I was saying about the common law versus equity, because equitable jurisdiction is absolutely key to the way that the offshore is playing out, or key to some of the attraction, continuing attraction of the offshore aside from or adjacent to its attractions for things like tax evasion. The other thing that I would just weave in here is that there's been a pretty significant rise of non-governmental organizations and international organizations that have made harmful tax competition an issue, right? Have sort of put it on the agenda for the OECD, for the G8, G7, for the Financial Action Task Force, and others. And Oxfam very early on articulated the position with reference to the harm that tax competition the role that it plays in the harming of populations around the world who then don't have access to healthcare, electricity, water, blah blah blah, because their state revenue collection is paltry because all of their elites are going offshore. I think that the real interesting jurisdictional shift that's taken place has to do largely with the role of whole new sets of actors. So, for instance, Chinese entrepreneurs who are now building all kinds of things and getting into especially tech areas where they have a whole new set of concerns than maybe their predecessors had, and those concerns have to do with things like the protection of intellectual property. That's one thing, and the other thing really is the increasing role, at least in the offshore, of some of these multilateral organizations, NGOs, and international bodies, which then has led to a kind of contest over sovereignty that often is the way that it plays out is often quite paradoxical, because you have British dependent territories very strongly arguing for the continuance of their relationship to the UK, while the UK is sort of trying to push them out of the fold. I know that was sort of a rambling roundabout answer, but these sort of jurisdictional questions, both in the sense of space and in the sense of the kind of question of what law is being spoken or who speaks the law, are absolutely central to what's been happening offshore in the past, say, 15 years.
Okay, I think that's a really good point to end on, to continue tomorrow with the second panel, which I think a lot of the same topics will be brought up, but more specifically relating to arts representation and incorporating structures offshore. But I wanted to thank both of you and Yuri, who is elsewhere, for participating today, and everybody who is here and tuned in. I hope you'll be able to make it tomorrow, but thanks again.
Thanks.
Thanks, Neil.
I forgot we were going to talk about art.
All right, bye, Bill.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.